Hello everybody. We're going to be looking at creating a picture of a rectangle using a for loop. Now if you remember, we had some requirements for this homework assignment. So the requirements are, we're going to do some comments. I'm going to use some block comments. And we're going to say, write a program that asks for two numbers between 2 and 10. This tells me that I need to do validation. The largest number will be assigned as the length and the smallest to the width. We will then draw a rectangle using the for loop and using the character X to display it. All right, so I have my comments. Now let's do our couple of directives. We need IOStream. We need to include IOStream so that we can use cout and cin for output and input. We're going to use the namespace standard to abbreviate your cout, cin, right? Now let's start writing our code. So we need our main function that in this case returns an integer. In this case is 0, meaning end of the program. So let's do the first part. Let's do our user input, right? But before we need user input, we need to have variables. In this case, we're going to be using numbers, they're whole numbers, and we have a restriction of 2 and 10. So that means these are small numbers. So I'm going to use a short integer. I'm going to use number 1 and number 2 as my variables for storing the user input. Okay, now this is important. Number 1 and number 2 will get their values from the user. Then the program asks to assign those numbers into either the length or the width. Now, because these are small numbers, the length and width can also be a short integer. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that because the length and the width do not get their input from the user, they get the input within your program. That means you need to cause a process to store the number 1 to the length or to the width. That means at this point, we need to initialize them because the user is not initializing them. So I am going to initialize this to 0. To be on the safe side, okay? In case we never get to put anything inside length or width, at least we have a number to start with. Otherwise, you're going to get a syntax error or a warning. So now that we have our variables, let's do the user input. So let's ask for those numbers. Okay, so please enter a number between 2 and 10. And then we say input that number. Remember, this is called the insertion operator, and this one is called the extraction operator. So we're going to enter that first number in number 1. Now we need to do validation. The number needs to be between 2 and 10. Okay, otherwise we do not perform the requirements of the program. So there's a couple of ways of you can do this. I am going to do the longer way first, and then I'm going to do the shorter way. So first one, once the user gave us the number 1, we could check if, right? We need to check if the number is between 2 and 10. So we're going to say if number 1 is less than 2, that would be a problem. Or number 1 is greater than 10, right? So if the number is smaller than 2 or bigger than 10, that means it's outside of the range. So we have to ask the user to give us a number again. I'm going to use this, I'm going to do this with a do while loop. So I'm going to do the following. I am going to do print out an error message. Huh? And I'm going to ask them to give me the number one more time. And I am going to continue to have them do this while my number 1 continues to be less than 2, or while my number 1 continues to be less than, greater than 10. So oh, this one needs to be greater. I just noticed that. Okay. All right. That was greater. All right. So less than, greater than. All right. So while my number is less than 2 or my number continues to be greater than 10, I'm not going to let the user get out of this loop until they give me that number that will work. And how do I check? Well, if the user enters 12, I'm going to ask, is the 12 less than 2? No, but let's check. Is the 12 greater than 10? Yes, it is. That means we go into this if statement. Now we tell them, hey, it's a 12. You're outside of the range. Try again. And you ask for that number one more time. And then it checks. Now I enter, let's say I enter the number -3. So is -3 less than 2? Yes, it is. It's true. So I don't even have to check this because in an OR, when one of them is true, everything is true. So because this is true, that means I get to do my loop again. So it tells me, hey, you're still outside of the range. Try it again. So I can continue to put a negative number or a number larger than 10, and this will continue until I finally enter a right number, such as the number 5. So the number 5 will be less than 2. No, it's false. All right, so is the number 5 greater than 10? That is also false. That means I exit the loop. Okay, remember that here we work a little bit opposite. Your loop continues to work while it's true. When the condition is false, it exits. Let's not forget we need that semicolon at the end of the do while. And then, we're good. We have done what is called data validation. Okay, that's way one. Let's do the second way. So I am going to just copy my user input again, except that I am going to change my variable name. So please enter a number between 2 and 10. This time I'm going to enter the number 2. Okay. And enter some spaces here. All right. Like, well, let's do it now. You can beautify later. All right. So now I am going to do my data validation a little bit different. All right. Remember this data validation? You could just copy and paste it and just change everything from number 1 to number 2, and that'll work. But let's do it a little bit simpler. Here, after the user enters a number 2, I am immediately going to go into the loop. All right. To see if it's wrong. So I'm going to say while. I'm going to use, instead of a do while, I'm going to use a while loop, which is a pretest loop. That means this is going to check before it even tries to go in. So while my number 2, this is the second number, is less than 2, or my number 2 is greater than 10, if one of those conditions is true, then we will tell them, sorry, your number is outside of the range. Please re-enter your number again. I'm going to copy that. And this one, of course, has to be number 2. Let's not forget to update that. And this will continue to happen until the user gives me the right number between 2 and 10. Okay? So notice the difference on data validation number 1 and data validation number 2. They do the exact same thing, but the difference in the loops does, make a little bit of change. Plus, I am saving an if statement. I don't have to use an if statement in this particular one because it's already been taken care of right here. So we've done our data validation. Let's continue with our program by assigning the proper number to the length or the width. So we're going to do assign numbers to length and width. So the first one we'll be doing by an if statement. We're going to say if, and there's only 3 things that could happen here. Either the number 1 is the biggest number, or the number 2 is the biggest number, or both numbers that were entered were the same. So we're going to say if the number 1 is greater than the number 2, we're going to say that my length, according to my requirements, is assigned the number 1. Notice that I mentioned assign. Length is assigned because this symbol right here is the assignment operator. All right. The equal operator is this one. So let's not get it confused with that double one. That's the equal operator. Okay. Now let's do the width is assign the number 2. Now, if this is not true, then that means the number 2 is larger, right? So we say else if number 2 is larger than number 1, we're going to assign the length to be number 2 and the width to be number 1. The last thing that could happen is if both numbers, number 1 and number 2, are the same. Now here, it's up to you how you do this. You could actually do something like this. Else if number 1 is equal, notice how we're using the double equal sign, not the single one. Number 2, then you can just say length is assigned number 1. It doesn't really matter which one you put. And you could even say that the width is assigned number 1 as well. Why? Because number 1 and number 2 are equal. They're the same, right? Now, again, I mentioned this is not necessary. And the reason that this particular if statement is not necessary because you only have three possible outcomes. Either number one will be the biggest, number two will be the biggest, and the last one is if they're the same. So you could actually delete that from there and it will still work. Okay. Finally, let's use our for statement to draw the rectangle. And we're going to do this by using nested for loops. And the reason we use nested for loops is because a rectangle has length and width, right? So it's two-dimensional. So that means that we need one loop to take care of the rows, and the inside loop takes care of the columns. Let's remember our syntax for our for loops. I immediately, as soon as I do my keyword for the for loop, I immediately do my open and close bracket just so that I don't forget. So a lot of times we forget to do that close bracket and then we have orphan brackets and it makes it difficult to debug. So let's go ahead and do our for loop. Remember that the for loop has three statements inside of its body. The first statement is generally the counter, which we can declare and initialize within the same for loop. So I'm going to declare a counter of type integer. Could be short, actually. And I am going to initialize this to 0 to start our countdown 0 or count up to 0. Then we're going to say that my counter, right, needs to be, so this loop is going to run while my counter is less than the length. Now, why do I choose the length? Because remember that the length is the one that goes across, which means that this is the row. And finally, we update our counter. Now the inner loop is going to take care of the columns. So I'm going to use another for loop. Immediately I do my open and close brackets so that I don't forget. And I am going to do my first statement, which is my counter 2. Actually, I could actually call it counter and it will be okay. It wouldn't interfere with this counter because this counter only exists while this loop is running. But just to keep things less confusing, I'm going to give it a separate name, counter 2, which I'm also going to initialize to 0. And then I'm going to say that counter 2 needs to continue to run while it is less than the number of columns. And the columns will be taken care of by my width. Actually, I think I did them backwards. Length. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the width, because my width is, let me put this in here. That's why comments are so important. Width is how many rows they're going to have. And length will take care of my columns. All right. There we go. Oh, not columns, length. There we go. And we update the counter. Counter 2. Now this inside loop is the one that is actually doing the drawing. So I'm going to see out the X, the letter X. It's a character, so it uses only a single quotation, different from these double quotations because this is an entire sentence with many characters together, which means it's a string. So this is just a single character. We use a single quotation. And I do not do an end of line because I want the X's to continue one after the other. Now, on my outer loop, this one, that's the one that's going to do the carriage return. So I want to put my end of line in here. Okay. All right, I think we're done. I'm just going to add an end of line right here, a couple of end of lines, just to have a spacing between my numbers and then my drawing. So let's go ahead and run this. Go to debug, start without debugging. My compiler runs my code right here. Please enter a number between 2 and 10. I want to make sure that my data validation works. Well, I'm going to enter a -5. Number, it's outside of the range. Try again. Well, let's see. Make sure it's not a fluke. Let's enter a -1. Hey, it still works. Great. Now let's make a number that is bigger than 10, such as 11. Nope. 85. Nope. So let's try with a number that will work, and that will be like a number 4. Yay, it works. So please enter a number between 2 and 10. So let's do the second number. I should have added a blank line there, right, to make it more readable. We are going to do the same thing. Got to test for everything, right? Oh, that still works. How about if I enter a 0? Yep, that's still outside of the range. So let's make a larger number. Yeah, so let's put a number like a 7. Perfect, right? And now we have our, it did it, the assignment, right? It did this part right here. We don't see that. That's a process. And then it draws 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 4 rows down because we have 4 and 7. And there it is. Your program that meets the requirements that the user wanted. Thanks.